So with that, I'd like to open our final talk of this 5-week series on the 5 basic unity principles. So to review, the first basic unity principle is this: that there is indeed only one power and one presence that is active in our lives and in the universe. And this is God, the good omnipotence. Principle number 2, you're it. All of God, all of good, all love, all wisdom, all beauty, and all perfection are within each and every person in this room. So look within at yourself and see the divine. Look to your neighbor and see God. And then the third basic unity principle says this: it's the law of mind action that says thoughts that we hold in mind produce after their kind. So as we hold these luscious thoughts of love, of good, of prosperity, we produce what's like in our lives and in our own beings. And then the fourth basic unity principle says, the power of affirmative prayer. Through prayer, we come into the knowing of our God self. And then finally today, as we move into the fifth basic unity principle, which essentially says that it's not enough to just know these 4 other principles. We must also live the truth that we know. And so with that, we'll enter into today's talk, which is living the truth. So now, if any of us pay attention to the news at all, and I know that some of us consciously elect not to pay attention to the news, some of us might be feeling a little discouraged or even just completely overwhelmed by the amount of suffering, the amount of challenge and of lack that appears to be happening in the world. And I know that I have personally had a recent story that's been on my mind and on my heart. And that's the story of a man named Eric Gardner. So this is a very controversial story, which is actually why I want to talk about it today. It's not with the idea to invite a political discussion or conflict or anything like that regarding it, but I want to talk about it today to illustrate how we can bring these spiritual principles, these truths that we know, to bear on how we show up in our beings and in our lives. So to this end, I'm glad that we're very prayed up in this moment, filled with the peace of God, right? And so I invite us to continue this, to continue to breathe deeply, allowing us to stay in this loving presence of the divine here in this room as we consider the story of Eric Gardner. So Eric was an African-American man who was killed in New York in July of this year at the hands of the New York police. According to the press, Gardner was being arrested on suspicion of selling loosies, which are single cigarettes from packs without stamps. When he resisted arrest, an officer named Pantaleo, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but Pantaleo put his arm around Gardner's neck and attempted to pull Gardner backward and onto the ground. There is substantial controversy over whether this act by the officer constituted a chokehold, which would be illegal in New York. So after Pantaleo removed his arm from Gardner's neck, 4 officers restrained him. And then he repeated what are now fairly infamous words: "I can't breathe," 11 times while lying face down on the sidewalk. About an hour later, Gardner was taken unconscious to the hospital, where he was then pronounced dead. The medical examiner ruled Gardner's death to be homicide, which meant that it was caused by a person or persons, though it was still possible that the homicide was not a wrongful or malicious killing under the law, but rather it could be considered something like a negligent homicide or even a justifiable homicide. And then on December 3rd, earlier this month, a grand jury decided not to indict Officer Pantaleo. So this incident has very understandably aroused a lot of conflict and controversy across the nation. The lack of an indictment stirred public protests and rallies with charges of police brutality, and the news was broadcast nationally. And my guess is that that conflict is not just out in the world, but that even here, amidst what is a rather close-knit spiritual community, there's likely to be substantial differences among even us as to, number one, what actually happened, right? Number two, how do we even interpret those facts? And number three, what, if anything, you, they, we, I should do about it? So I'm sharing this story not to incite anger or conflict or even sadness, but rather to empower us, to open this discussion within ourselves and even within community, so that we may, as the fifth basic unity principle says, knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, are not enough. A person must also live the truth that he or she knows. What's interesting to me about Eric Garner's story, and perhaps many stories like it, is that it's unlikely that we will ever know with certainty what happened in truth, right? But then I thought, isn't this the truth of all human existence, the truth with a lowercase t, that we don't ever know all the facts of what is going on, even in our own lives, much less another's. And yet we are charged with making decisions about it, right? We are charged with acting even without that level of knowing. So I would invite us to consider this, that in the face of infinite unknowns in every scenario, in every decision of our lives, that we can always choose truth with the capital T, the truth that we know spiritually. In the midst of not knowing the truths with the lowercase t, we can always choose to live from that higher spiritual truth from the inside out. So today, that's what I'd like to explore with you here together, that we might do this from the unity perspective. It's certainly not the only way to do it from the unity perspective, but this is a way that I have found works for me in my own life. So there are three main elements to this. First, at least for me, living in truth means that we live in service to spirit rather than in service to our egos or in service to the material world. Second, it's important to recognize that the path of serving or expressing spirit differs often widely for each of us, and it is not ours to judge another's path, what they are or are not doing, what they should be or should not be doing. And then finally, Our ability to live the truth, to express our Christ nature, is founded first and foremost on our being and not our doing. That is to say, we must first embody God's good in our own being before we can manifest it more greatly in our lives and in the world. So the first point, living the truth means living with our egos in service to our spirit and not the other way around. Yet too often, at least for me, our egos run the show almost from the moment we wake up, right? There are things I want to do and things I want to accomplish. And generally, I might think, oh, this law of attraction tools are very helpful. Maybe I can use these tools to get my ego's needs met. We might not think this consciously. We might just think, these are the things I want to do. And lo and behold, there are spiritual tools that will help me manipulate my life to get me those things. Well, I don't think any of that is wrong, like in the evil, wrong sense. I do think that that path is misguided. And I think that too often what we tend to see as the ills of the world are from many, many egos operating just like that in the world. And I found personally in my life that when I have strived and even accomplished my egoic goals that don't come from my higher self, that while I may accomplish those goals, I never actually get in that way those things that I was looking for in accomplishing those goals, like a sense of contentment, of joy, or of peace, the things that I was looking for. Because I didn't realize that if I actually started with spirit rather than ego, then it wouldn't be about what I was looking for. It would be that place that I was looking from. I would be starting with peace, with joy, with love. I would be starting with a sense of abundance, and that would overflow into my living, into the next goal of my life. So living in truth reverses our traditional or habituated directional thinking. It means we begin with this consciousness of peace, abundance, and we live from that consciousness. As Davenport, who wrote the 5 Basic Unity Principles, which I've quoted from quite extensively during this series, she says, when we are living in truth, any action we take will be from a consciousness of spirit and of oneness, with ego in service to soul. When we are living the truth, any action we take will be from a consciousness of spirit and oneness, with ego in service to soul. And on that note, I want to move to our second point for today, which is that it's important not to judge whether someone else is acting in service to ego or spirit. I'm not just pointing at my husband. Someone else. It's important not to judge. Because the truth of it is, even if we think we know, we don't really know, right? Someone can even appear to us to be very good, upstanding people and expressing spirit because they're working on what the world would traditionally call a noble cause, right? But from the unity perspective, we wouldn't see this as someone living the truth if what is really happening is being driven by the ego or our collection of personal wounds and baggage that the mystic Eckhart Tolle calls our pain bodies, right? Pain bodies. So Eckhart Tolle says this: sometimes people with dense pain bodies become activists, fighting for a cause. And the cause may indeed be worthy, and they are sometimes successful at first in getting things done, right? However, the negative energy that flows into what they say and do, and their unconscious need for enemies and conflict tend to generate increasing opposition to their cause. So actions that do not come from peace never ultimately create peace, no matter what we effort and endeavor to do. Because, as we've learned via the third basic unity principle, thoughts held in mind produce after their kind. So to use my husband again, to illustrate the difference between spirit-based versus fear or anger or ego or pain body-based actions, Victor has given me permission, prior permission, to share a story from his own spiritual journey. So when Osama bin Laden was killed, and much of the nation was celebrating, if you remember that, Victor posted onto his Facebook wall a statement to this effect. You know, everyone has karma, but our rejoicing in bin Laden's death makes us no better than Al-Qaeda rejoicing in the death of Americans. Not surprisingly, Victor got a few energetic responses to this post. And then Victor, of course, proceeds to spend hours of his time answering these responses. And so that's what it came about, right? Taking sides. Who's right? Who's wrong? Why? And so for this time, Victor's spirit, his life force or energy, was being used in service to the egoic aims of justifying my position, right? Yeah. Or getting others to ally with my position. And he did this for a while, but being as he's on a spiritual path, he caught himself in doing this. And so at this moment, and these are his words as he phrased it, he found that he was caught up with arguing the truth with a lowercase t. But upon realizing what he was doing, he stopped. He hid all the comments from his wall. We can show you how to do that if you don't know already. And then he went on to one of his primary spiritual practices, which is meditation, going into the silence. So he did this. He went within himself to know spirit in him. And from spirit, what came out of him was music. So what was his soul's calling in that moment of being at peace within his being was, it turns out, not to argue with other people, but to affirmatively create something beautiful. So now this song, which is called Every Day I Walk the Path, actually won't be out until Victor puts out his second CD. But as you know, Victor is ill and can't sing today, but since I have a little bit of influence with him, I was able to get him to share a raw recording, unheard of, unpublished, with all of you.
So this is just a clip of that song.
Every voice will find a song to sing up to the sky, and every cloud's a dream in a child's eyes, and every war-torn soldier finds peace or peace of mind, and every day I walk along the path. Every heartache opens up my weary wayward eyes, and every question leads right back to me. Oh, and I know too, like each of you, that all things come to pass, 'cause every day we walk along the path, 'cause every day we walk along the path, 'cause
So I just told you that we're not supposed to judge which is the proper expression of spirit and which isn't, but but I would say the song more likely, if you know what I mean, right? So on the topic of this desire to sort of take action in the social realm, I want to say something. I want to comment on what we refer to often as social activism. Because the fifth basic unity principle is often, and I believe incorrectly, used as the basis for demanding that all of us engage in this thing called social activism. While I agree that the fifth basic unity principle might be the basis for inspiring some of us to that, I don't believe that it's everyone's calling. Now, I want to qualify that by saying that certainly if we are all one in spirit, right? Living the truth necessarily means that we are called to serve that one body of Christ, that we are called to serve our fellow brothers and sisters. I mean, called from the inside out, that we are inspired to do that, to serve the common good in some way. But it's important to recognize that how we do this is unique to each of us. That while we are called to serve the one, how we do this is unique to each of us. And the fact that spirit expresses differently in each of us is why we might have disagreement in the world and even in spiritual community. So each of us is called to show up in a way where only we are uniquely called or uniquely situated to show up. So spiritual community, in my view, is not to make us all the same, to make us all start acting the same, doing the same things, right? But if anything, it's a safe and sacred space in which we not only tolerate, but actually deeply, sincerely value each other's differences. That we can have space to make that conflict, those differences, apparent, explicit, and have that not be a crisis, right? Have that be a celebration, a way of understanding the different ways in which spirit expresses. So in a world in which only God exists, that's the unity world. From the unity perspective, this can be seen as saying that if I don't see God in another person, if I don't see God in a particular situation, then dear God, I need to right my seeing. Then I would pray, dear God, help me to see the situation differently. Help me to see the oneness that is here in truth with a capital T. Help me to see the blessing that is in what seems like only conflict. The unity perspective thus invites us to be open to the blessings that we cannot already see. And the more we acknowledge this truth, the invisible spirit back of all things, the more we acknowledge truth with a capital T, the more that truth will unveil itself in our environment. The irony is that we have to believe that truth before we can see it. We have to believe it before we can see it. As co-founder of the Unity Movement, Charles Fillmore taught, pronounce every experience good and of God. And by that mental attitude, what seemed error will disappear and only the good will remain. This is the law and no one can break it. So, rather than fighting constantly against whatever we dislike or disagree with, as Victor originally did, we can withdraw our energy from it, as Victor came to do. So it's not that we shouldn't care about others, but it matters how we care for others. Our act of love and faith shows up in not having to force our will on some external situation, and instead trusting that if we turn within to Spirit for peace, for love, for guidance, that we will be shown exactly what to do. So in her book, The 5 Principles, Ellen Davenport puts it well when she says this, that spiritual action does not demand that we all participate in peace demonstrations, save the environment, take down big corporations, though we each might individually be called to one or the other. But it does mean that at base, integrating our divine essence into ordinary, annoying, daily living with its drudgery, its confusion, and its difficult people. How do we apply these principles when we're sick, broke, heartbroken, scared, angry, or apathetic? How do we make choices day in and day out in alignment with principle so that we can, bit by bit, create the kingdom of heaven on earth? So finally, living in truth is primarily, that is to say, foundationally, about being rather than doing. The idea behind this is that if you look at the 5th basic unity principle, you'll notice that it's last, and I think it's last for a reason. The first 4 basic unity principles are focused on transforming consciousness. These are concepts that grow us. An idea of God that is so expansive, in fact, is so infinite. The idea that we are that. These thoughts held in mind per the 3rd basic unity principle, they grow us. And as we deepen our connection to that truth in prayer, then we come out at the 5th basic unity principle, having become that which we seek, so that our doing inevitably, naturally follows from our being. That is the goal. That our doing naturally flows from our being. We become first. So, Davenport, who's a very pragmatic woman, acknowledged this in her book. You know, every time you hear about this idea, this principle that we're creating our experience in consciousness, you're likely to hear someone harumph, that you can't just sit around thinking positive thoughts, right? Person in the back, the congregation, can't just sit around thinking positive thoughts. You have to take action. And she says, actually, no. The shift in consciousness makes the difference. No matter how many resumes you send out, no matter how hard you work, no matter how long your house has been on the market, life is consciousness first. And then we take action as inspired. So being or embodying spirit is the precursor to spirit-inspired action. What we do flows from what we are. So in conclusion, as I said before, I don't believe that every one of us is called to social activism. I also know, though, that I personally am. I'm called to things like prison ministry, for instance. I'm called to feed the homeless. These are parts of my ministry that I'm personally called to do. But I really don't believe that we are all called to the same activities, that we are all called to social activism, but I do believe that we are all universally called to spiritual action, to living the truth as each of us know it and embody it. And I believe that we each have an important and, in fact, a necessary role in birthing greater good in ourselves and then in the world, each in our own unique ways. Perhaps it's being the most loving parent that you could possibly be. Or perhaps it's being an inspiring school teacher or minister, right? Perhaps it's being an artist or musician, right? And perhaps it's not even a particular career or role, but it's just about being called to simply, generally treat every single person who crosses your path with dignity, compassion, and respect. So spiritual action first requires in all of us a shift in consciousness that we make by turning to prayer. By doing so, each of us can live more fully, not from those egoic or false selves, but by the truth that we know, the truth that actually, deep down, we actually are, right? So here, I trust with all of my heart that each and every person in this room not only has the capacity to do this, but is expressing the truth that he or she, that you or I know right here in this moment. So it is, and amen.